What's going on, YouTube? It's Tom here. We're back with another video today. Today we're going to be talking about carbide tear out and why I think it does not happen. I posted about this on my Instagram a few days ago, got a ton of DMs on it, and responded to all of those DMs, but I figured it is just way easier to make a video about this with images and pictures and just better explanations than what I can do just over text. So let's go ahead and get started here. And as you can see, title is Carbide Tear Out Doesn't Happen. So I remember early on when I was first getting into sharpening, hearing about this carbide tear out, and that led me to research what it was and the reasons that were claimed to cause it. I remember back when I first was getting into sharpening, this whole carbide tear out theory was pretty popular. For those of you who aren't aware or just don't really look into this stuff very much, carbides are small, harder pieces in the steel that are made up of carbon and one or more different elements. Some are harder, like vanadium or molybdenum based carbides, and some are softer, like chromium based carbides. The carbides in a steel are almost like chunk rock here in concrete. They're just smaller, harder pieces, and the rest of the concrete is what would be called the steel matrix. These carbides are your main contributor to edge retention. That's why when you see higher vanadium steels or higher carbide steels, there's going to be more carbide in there that gives you longer edge holding. And these carbides are bound to the steel matrix, just like here in this concrete, these rocks are bound inside of the concrete. The steel matrix holds the carbides in, just like the concrete holds these chunks of rock in. The problem with carbide tear out arises when sharpening with abrasives that aren't hard enough to abrade the carbides themselves, which in theory would lead to the matrix being worn away since it is softer than the carbides, and then that leaves the carbides exposed and bound less firmly in the matrix. Now this in theory could lead to them being torn from the matrix in sharpening and in use, which would lead to less edge retention. So as you can see here, these little lumps are carbides, and obviously everything else around it is matrix, is the steel matrix. And this was sharpened with something that was non-diamond, so a softer abrasive, and you can see that it didn't really touch the carbides. It left them pretty much intact, but the steel matrix around it has been worn away, leaving the carbides exposed. I don't think that this carbide tear out happens, and let me explain why. So first off, I'm not a metallurgist. I'm just a guy who enjoys the intricacies of sharpening and has read way too many articles on the subject. So the classic situation that carbide tear out could happen is you'd be sharpening something high in harder carbides and with a non-diamond or CBN abrasive, which would lead to that matrix being worn away, just like you saw in the last picture. You may notice that if you've tried this yourself, the knife gets plenty sharp, but the edge retention does suffer if you quantify it. So like what I do here on the channel, cutting cardboard, counting, how much cardboard I cut and how long that edge lasts. If you quantify it with a diamond progression and then a non-diamond progression, you will notice that the diamond progression lasts a heck of a lot longer than what the non-diamond one does. And that's something I've done here on the channel a couple times. Once with Max Cement, I did another one a few months back with S90V, I believe. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, just look back on the channel, you'll find it. What I've noticed over the years of doing this is that if you use a full diamond or CBN progression, the edge comes up much more crisp. Now this picture that you're seeing right here is an edge shaped with just a full diamond and CBN progression. I believe it was finished with a lapping film, so you can see the carbides are not sticking out at all. These little chunks here are not sticking out at all, and they're just flat with the matrix. That is ideally what you're looking for. Compare that to something like this that we just saw a couple slides ago, and that the edge was finished with something that is non-diamond. You'll see those carbides sticking out, proud of the matrix, and not abraded whatsoever. This is where I think the lack of edge retention comes from. The carbides not being ground fully with a non-diamond or CBN abrasive. Sharpness at its simplest form is your size of your apex width. So the smaller the apex, the sharper the edge. Also, the smaller the apex, the more edge retention, because the apex width has to grow further until it becomes too thick to cut, or what we know it as becoming dull. So forgive me here, I'm not an artist, but this is what a cross section would look like if you're sharpening with non-diamond abrasives. You can see obviously those carbides, that's going to be distributed throughout this entire edge. But the carbides here that are still sticking out, you have part of the carbide sticking out. If you get all the way down here to the very apex, if there are carbides that are not ground away, it's going to be thicker than what an apex that's formed with diamond and CBN abrasives would. You can see just how much finer this tip would be if you don't have those big chunks sticking out. So if those carbides are full size at the apex, there's no way that the apex could be smaller than if the carbides were shaped like this one. Another theory is that with the larger grit particles in the coarser stones, the carbides are scooped out of the matrix since they're smaller than the abrasive particles that are being used at that point. That would technically mean that you could use non-diamond abrasives for the coarser stones. Not sure why you'd even want to do this, because the diamond stones are going to be the most effective since they're the most aggressive stones and would remove the most amount of material. But as you can see from this picture right here, it seems that the particles, even in coarser stones, do not cut deep enough to remove full carbides, and instead it actually looks like they're braided in place until they actually fracture and shatter, and then they are removed. This picture right here was mainly, this is just a picture of burr. This is one large piece of burr that's being flexed back and forth. You can see these carbides here have cracked and shattered, and the ones up top here, on top of being shattered and having stress cracks, are braided away flat with the rest of the matrix. Again, here's another picture. The carbides underneath the surface are okay. These are two separate carbides here with a boundary. You have one here that has fractured closer to the surface, and the carbides here up at the very surface, you can see, are just absolutely pulverized. Cracks all throughout, a little chunk of one missing here. So they basically just fracture and then are eventually pulled out with the steel matrix as it's being worn away. So looking at these two pictures here, carbides are definitely removed in sharpening, but they're not torn from the matrix whole like we thought could possibly happen before. They are braided until they become weak enough to shatter and are then removed. The craters that they're going to leave in the matrix are pretty much negligible, I would say. They're more than likely sub 1/10 of a micron, if I had to guess, and then they would be removed in further stages of sharpening. So let's say you're sharpening this with your coarsest stone. Obviously this from top to bottom here, this is 1 micron in scale. Top to bottom here is less than half a micron easily. If this is your coarsest stone and you move on to your next stone, more than likely by the time that you burr up on either side, those little craters or holes that the carbides left, if they got those little pieces got pulled out or fell out, would be removed by your next stone. So those craters are pretty much a non-factor. Another thing that I hear people say is that, if you finish with a non-diamond stone, or you're using non-diamond stones in your progression, that you could possibly have tear out in use. In my opinion, tear out in use is also highly unlikely to happen. I won't say it's impossible, just because there's honestly not a whole lot of research on this, but I would say that it's highly unlikely to happen. The bond of the carbides to the matrix is incredibly strong. This picture right here is Maximate microbeveled with a Japanese natural stone, and you can see the carbides are very exposed here, but they're pretty firmly adhered to the matrix. There's really no danger of them popping out. You can see they're pretty good, or they're pretty in there. They're not going to be coming out very easily at all. This picture right here, this is that same knife after 20 cuts into hard plastic. This would be pretty brutal on an edge if the carbides were not held in place very firmly. You would think that was something this stressful, it would pull the carbides from the matrix. If they weren't firmly planted. But as you can see, the carbides are still here, still hanging on very, very firmly in place. The most damage I think these carbides could sustain would possibly be shattering after being weakened, like we see in sharpening. This would expose fresh, jagged edges of carbide that are less refined than they were initially. So let's just imagine that this carbide here got worn down and weakened enough that it fractured throughout here. That would just expose the fresh, jagged edges of it, and that could possibly be what we call a working edge. how after it breaks down from that initial keenness, that initial sharpness, that it breaks down into a working edge and stays that way for a long period of time. My hypothesis would be that something like that is happening. Those carbides are fracturing, and then you have these fresh exposed edges of carbide, but obviously since they're breaking, they're not as keen as the initial ones were when they were freshly shaped. So let's get to some conclusions here. Obviously, diamond abrasives are still incredibly important. They reduce your apex width, leading to keener and longer lasting edges. We already knew that, but I think it's kind of important to understand what's going on at a microscopic level to understand why diamonds are so important. Carbides are not removed in sharpening or in use. The most damage they sustain is shattering in the early stages of sharpening. They're not pulled from the matrix at all. I really think that we underestimate the bonds of the carbides in the steel matrix. It's literally a molecular bond, and that takes a ton of force to be broken. I think it's way stronger than what we realize. They're not fragile. They don't come out nearly as easily as, like, let's say, a piece of stone and concrete would. It's definitely a very, very strong bond. And last but not least, we have to remember to get the most performance out of your knives. If you're buying these higher carbide steel knives, Maximate K390, S90V, Rex 45, S110V, any steel that boasts, high edge retention, we should be using diamond and CBN abrasives. Other abrasives will definitely do the job, but not as efficiently, and you're definitely missing out on your steel's true potential if you're using those. And again, it needs to be said, I'm not an expert on this stuff by any means. These are just my hypotheses as to what happens and why. Hopefully more studies and articles will be published on this subject with more empirical data as to what happens and why sometime here in the future. Speaking of that, probably the best articles we have on this subject come from scienceofsharp.com. His articles on the carbides in Maximate and K390 are where I pulled all of these SEM microscope images from. Go check his site out. It's so cool to be able to see all of this stuff at a molecular level. I think it's an incredibly valuable resource for the knife and sharpening community. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to drop a like down below and subscribe if you aren't already. 80% of the people who watch my videos are not subbed, so help me out by hitting that subscribe button. And as always, guys, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.